Exclusively on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheists Manifesto. Hello and welcome to the Gaytheists Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and I am joined today by my co-host, Daniel Wolfsong.
Hello, lovelies.
Today we are talking about religious harm. We're going to discuss the harm that religion has done both to the LGBT community and anyone who happens to be on the quote-unquote wrong side of the religious question. First up, we have with us my friend Renee, who is going to share her story of her exit from religion. And after that, we'll have a discussion about the anti-LGBT sentiment that is largely based in religion and some awful, awful things that have been perpetrated against our community in the name of religion, like conversion therapy. But first, let's welcome Renee to the show. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's just hear a little bit about your story. Tell me about you.
My name is Renee, like you said. I was born and raised in the South. I was raised Church of Christ, which is a fundamentalist religion. Went to a Church of Christ school from 3rd grade until I graduated from high school. Went to the military, and when I went to nursing school, that was the first time I'd ever heard anything as far as, of Charles Darwin or survival of the fittest or evolution, natural selection, any of that. So you talk about rocking my whole worldview. I mean, it just got shaken up because we were young Earth creationists, and as far as what we were taught, the Earth was 6,000 years old, and I had been taught that from 3rd grade on, so I really did not know any better. My first husband was also Church of Christ, and I was the typical Proverbs 31 housewife. I'm not sure if you understand what that reference is or not.
I was going to say, I don't know the Bible super well, so what is Proverbs 31?
What that is fundamentalist wives were basically to be, seen and not heard. We were very submissive to the husband. The husband was the head of the household. We did not question any dictates that the husband laid down. That was, a sin that would send you to hell. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Vicki Garrison's story or not.
I know I've heard the name. I'm not sure that I know the story though.
She was in the Queer Revolt movement, which, is also a fundamentalist, but they, are a little different than the Church of Christ. We were very legalistic as far as we went strictly by the Bible, and especially a lot of Paul's teachings, minus all of the kids. I didn't have 20 kids.
Right.
So, but basically, I was taught to be a total submissive wife and to do everything that I was told and not to question it. Anytime that I did question it, that got me physically and mentally abused. And the thing about it is, when I went to talk to my minister about it, I was told to pray harder, and that evidently there was something wrong with me, that I was committing some sort of sin, or else this would not be happening to me. So the more submissive that I became, the more abusive my ex became, and it became a vicious, circle. After I'd been there for about a year, his supervisor finally helped me get out. He had starved me down to 88 pounds, because he literally gave me what I was allowed to eat and not eat. He controlled what I wore, what color lipstick I wore. He controlled everything about me. And all I was supposed to do was do everything he told me and not question it, and that is what I did. I wanted to leave sooner and was told that I would go to hell if I left and divorced him, and I believed it with everything in my being. So I prayed very hard that he would get better and change his ways, and he got more and more abusive, and he almost did kill me. And one day I finally got to the point where I said, I would rather be dead than be there with him, and I would take my chances and go to hell if that was what was to be.
Wow.
And I finally got out.
Well, I'm glad you got out.
Too. Had I not gotten out, I would be dead.
Right.
And to, I guess, touch on that, the harm that it does, when this happened, this was in the 80s in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. And back then, after Bill Clinton ended up getting elected president, Mike Huckabee took over as governor. Mm-hmm. And he had tried to push this thing in Arkansas called covenant marriage. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No. Please elaborate.
What covenant marriage is when you get married, the only grounds that you have for divorce would be adultery, or if the spouse happened to abandon you for more than a year. Other than that, no divorce.
So that's like Jesus's biblical definition of what it is, right?
Probably so. Actually, I think that probably came from Paul.
Okay, because I thought I remembered reading somewhere in the Bible where Jesus said that literally, like, the only reason that's acceptable for divorce is sexual impropriety or infidelity or whatever. Like, so basically, if your spouse cheats on you, you get to divorce. Other than that, it's, if you get married again, it's adultery.
It wasn't only, the covenant marriage is not only remarriage again, but just getting a divorce in general. If you have a covenant marriage, the state would not grant you a divorce even for abuse.
Wow. And so did that become a thing? Like, did that? It
did not. He pushed for it very hard when he was still governor, and had it become a thing, I would be dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would not have been able to get away from him. And he and his wife Janet do have a covenant marriage, good for them. And he has said that if he is elected president, he would like to see covenant marriage made a federal law.
Just one more reason to not like that guy.
He's a theater.
Yeah, seriously.
That's amazing. I'm surprised that I didn't know that.
This, like I said, this was back in, trying to think, 90 and 91 is when it came up. I was going through this in 88 and 89. So had it been a thing, I would still, I would not still be married. I'd be dead.
Right.
Yeah.
He would have killed me. But the thing about it is also at that time in Arkansas, there was no such law on the books as marital rape. Now that did change in 1993.
Right.
But there was no such thing as a legal separation in the state. You were either married or you were divorced. There was no in between. And so even if you physically moved away and left, if your soon-to-be ex-spouse were to force you to have sex, that was not considered rape.
Right.
And, so we did play this little game for a while to where, he would force relations on me and reset the clock because you had to not have relations for 60 days before they would grant the divorce. So it got drug out a little bit that way.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And, my attorney told me that even though it was, by force, even at knife point, that it was not considered rape as far as the state was concerned. Now that, like I said, that did change in 1993.
So in order for him to get around the law that would allow you to divorce him, he would rape you. Mm-hmm. And then that would give him the legal ground to keep you from divorcing him.
Right. And the thing about it is we didn't have a house or children or any property, but he did not want to grant me the divorce. And at that time, in the 80s, you had to have grounds. And the grounds that I was trying to use was mental and physical abuse. But if you had conjugal relations with the spouse, then that would they would consider that you had reconciled even though you really hadn't, and that would reset the 60 days.
Jesus Christ. So let me ask this. When a lot of times when we hear stories like this, obviously anyone who has half a heart is going to have a visceral reaction to a story like this. But I think what a lot of people will say is that, well, these things are rare. These things don't happen very often, right? So what's your experience of that, and how common these kinds of things actually are? I mean, how common they were then and how common they still are now. What's your impression of that?
Well, I do know that there was a law that was passed, after I had gotten divorced that was based on the Tracy Thurman case, where she had a restraining order against her husband and the police would not interfere, and her ex-husband almost killed her, and finally they did pass something, saying that the police would be more proactive. I had a restraining order against my ex-husband, and he violated it probably 30 or 40 times at least, but they would arrest him and then let him out within a couple of hours. And like my attorney said, a piece of paper would not stop him, and it didn't. But after going forward with my story, there were several other people who contacted me and contacted people who've had me on their podcasts to say that they're glad I came forward because they've been too ashamed to come forward, or they thought that they were the only ones that this had happened to. And I'm finding out that there are more people like me out there than I ever realized. And they do need help. And it took me a good 30 years to be able to talk about it. But for a long time, I was very embarrassed and ashamed and didn't want anyone to understand what had happened to me, because it was very mortifying at the time. It was embarrassing that someone had that kind of control over me for so long, and there was nothing I could really do about it. Both of us were active duty military, so a lot of people would say, why didn't you just leave? But he was with me literally 24/7. We had the same job in the military. We had the same hours, and I was not even allowed to go to the bathroom with the door closed because he knew that if I had 30 seconds, I'd be out that window and gone.
Oh.
And so I was not allowed to go anywhere by myself. I couldn't go for a walk. I couldn't go across the street. We had one car. He had control of all the finances. And one time that I did try to make a break for it, he ripped the phone out of the wall. So I couldn't call the police. What was I supposed to do? And, the one time that I did try to run for it, like I said, he ripped the phone out of the wall. And he did tell me, if you ever try to leave again, bitch, I'll kill you. And then I'll kill myself. And he was serious. He would have.
So, talk to me about how you see religion playing into this, because obviously we know that not all religious people are abusers and not all abusers are religious people, but I tend to think that when you're convinced of something like that and you have this external authority like a God telling you that this is your place and that this is okay to do because in the biblical definition of marriage, the wife is property. So talk to me a little bit about that, about how you see religion's active role in this situation.
Being raised fundamentalist, that is part of being fundamentalist, is you look at what the Bible says and you take a very literal interpretation of what it says. And so the way that I was raised, was men were the ones who made the rules and the women were supposed to be submissive and silent and sweet, and that left me wide open for abuse. And so I was conditioned pretty much to be a doormat, basically. I didn't know any better.
Under threat of eternal punishment.
Well, yes, because I knew that if I got divorced, that meant that I would go to hell because that's adultery. And that was, one of the big sins. Fornicators and adulterers will not go to heaven.
Right.
And that was really drummed into me, especially going to a fundamentalist school, from grade school on, that I would go to hell if I divorced him. And I knew that at 19 years old, I was awfully young to be faced with the prospect of being alone for the rest of my life, and terrified that I was going to go to hell, and having to make a decision: do I take the chance I'm going to go to hell, or do I stay here and let him kill me? Because either way, I'm not going to live. And that was a really hard decision. It was very traumatizing.
Sure. The fact that you chose, especially at such a young age, that you said, I'd rather face the possibility of spending eternity in hell than dealing with this, just speaks volumes of how terrible it must have been.
It was, and I guess it goes to human instinct. Self-preservation is a very strong motivator.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're standing there with someone pulling a knife on you because you had the audacity to eat a French fry without permission, which I'm dead serious, you start to reevaluate. And you're going, do I take a chance? I thought, well, a loving God would not want this for me because I'm terrorized. I'm fearful all the time. I was having nightmares, and, I still have PTSD, and I still do get triggered. But I thought, a loving God would not want this for me the rest of my life. And I lived in fear every day that I didn't know what was going to set him off, because the rules would change every day. And he would remind me, I'm the husband. You're supposed to be submissive. When I say jump, you better ask me how high, and you better do it immediately. And if you don't, you're going to get hurt.
You said that you have PTSD, and we know now that it's a very serious disorder.
Yes.
And you said that some things trigger you to this day. Can you talk about some of those triggers that you experienced today?
Some of them would be hearing other people talk about domestic violence, or talking about abuse in fundamentalism. Like, for example, Nate Phelps. I can listen to his story of what Fred Phelps did to him and his brothers and sisters when he was growing up in Westboro Baptist Church. But listening to what Fred Phelps did to his mom, I was caught off guard for part of that, that part of his talk. And if I know something's coming up, I can take medication ahead of time and kind of mentally brace myself for it and be okay. But I was not expecting the part of Nate's talk where he was talking about his mom having her hair cut off by force and being beaten and raped and things like that, and that triggered me.
Right.
And so I didn't sleep for 5 or 6 days. I couldn't eat. I was bouncing off the walls, and almost ended up being admitted to a psychiatric ward. I had to go to the emergency room. And when I was at ReasonCon, hearing Tracy Harris talk about the hotline and some of the calls that people had made, as far as, calling in the middle of the night saying they were going to go to hell for leaving their religion, or they'd been disowned by their parents or whatever, that also triggered me. And I had to make an emergency therapy appointment when I got home, and it took me about a month to recover from that. So any kind of spiritual abuse or anything, if I'm not mentally prepared for it, it can trigger me.
Yeah, I remember the first time you and I actually met in person was right after that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just hugging the crap out of you.
Yeah. It's pretty bad. And actually I'm still going to a therapist once a week from the incident in April, so it does take a while. I'm doing better now, but it took about a month before I was able to sleep normally and kind of regulate. A lot of people, I think, throw around the word trigger too lightly.
Sure.
Right? When they think, oh, something upset me, so I'm triggered. But when I get triggered, that means I can't function and I don't sleep for days and I'm pacing and crying and bouncing off the walls. And,
Right.
you know, I also have bipolar disorder and it causes me to cycle and I'll go manic for several days and it's pretty scary.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself coming out of your faith and beginning a path out of your religion?
I started questioning, when I was finally able to get away from my first husband, I started questioning, what kind of a loving God would let me go through this. When I got into nursing school, I was going, whoa, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to me. The earth is only 6,000 years old, and you're telling me all this, the earth is 4.5 million years old, and things were not adding up. And so I'm going, okay, what else have I been lied to about? But every time I would start to question, I would recoil and go, if I start to question, I'll go to hell, because that was part of the programming. You just didn't question. Because to question meant you would go to hell because you were doubting, and that was not allowed. And it took me probably a good 20 years. This is going to sound really cliche. I hate to say it, but I finally found the God delusion.
That was the first atheist book I ever read. Don't feel bad.
Yeah,
well, I read
cliche.
one by Michelle Goldberg called Kingdom Coming that was talking about, some of the theocrats and the fundamentalists and how they were trying to hijack government and things, and I could see what she was talking about. And then I picked up the God Delusion at the library, and I was so afraid to pick it up. Mm-hmm. I was like, is lightning gonna strike me or what?
Right.
And I was scared somebody would see me pick it up, but I was just like surreptitiously carrying it up to the counter and acting all embarrassed and everything. But after I read it, that was it. Mm-hmm. And this was about 9 or 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. The last pieces fell away. And I said, okay, this is all bull. I no longer believe.
Well, and let me ask this. So, obviously there was a lot of, shame and guilt and generally bad feelings because of, what you were taught by your religion. Mm-hmm. About many things, not even just the abuse, but just, about being a human being in general and being a woman, you're just terrible by default, even if, the abuse and stuff hadn't happened. So, was it, did you lose when you coming out of your religion, did you lose anything that you felt was positive? And did you ever actually take any sort of comfort or solace in those beliefs, or was it strictly the bad feelings that you had that you were able to get out of?
Well, at the time, I took comfort that, okay, when my grandmother died, I would see her again and things like that. Yeah. Now when my dad passed away in 91, he was not saved as far as I knew. He never went to church. He was one of the best people that you would ever hope to know.
Right.
And I remember agonizing at his funeral thinking, what if he's in hell? He can't possibly be in hell. He was such a good person. Right. And if he is, then, that's not fair. And so that caused me a lot of agony, but I was still struggling and not, there yet. This was a very long process.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sure at the time when I was in, it helped as far as I felt like somebody was there listening to me when I was praying, until I realized there's nobody there and I'm talking to myself. And at first that was kind of scary.
Right.
That, oh no, I'm alone without a safety net. But after I got used to the idea, it's like, no, actually all of these things that I've ever done, it was me. I didn't.
Right.
It was very empowering.
I was just gonna say, I bet because, you know, one of the threads that I hear throughout, you know, anyone talking about any sort of abusive situation is that feeling of powerlessness. And I bet that was a pretty powerful thing to say that, like, no, like, this is me, like, I can take back control of my life from these things. So I bet that was a pretty powerful experience. Yeah,
but it definitely wasn't overnight. It was decades.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think the same thing with my husband. You know, he is not a believer either. He was raised Southern Baptist, and when we got married,
and you're talking about your current
husband now.
No, okay.
We've been married for 21 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a philosophy professor, and he teaches comparative religion and all sorts of other things. And I think he was a lapsed Methodist when we got married.
Yeah.
And he was kind of wavering too, and now he's like. And
you know,
my daughter she's an agnostic, and you know, but she's kind of like, I don't know, I don't care, I have time to worry about it later, and we let her come to that conclusion herself.
Well, yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think that's probably this, in an ideal world, I think that's how everyone should feel about religion. You know what I mean? Like, it would be awesome if atheist activism wasn't necessary.
Yeah. I mean, she supports a secular student alliance and things, but she asked to go to church with her friends a few times, and we let her.
Sure.
We have several books around the house that she can read, as far as, you know, like the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Upanishads. Any questions that she's ever had, my husband can help her with.
Right, because that's what he does.
Because that's what he does. And so we never tried to push anything on her. You know, we'd say, well, some people believe this and some people believe that. And we let her come to her own conclusion.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think that's awesome. You're basically giving her the freedom to have her own experiences and explore her own intellectual journey with these things and come to her own conclusions.
And the conclusion she came with is there may be a God up there, there may not be. I don't know. I'm not really worried about it right now, but if it's Bible God's a jerk. So we know it's not that one.
Right.
So,
Yahweh is a jerk, for sure. You know, earlier you were talking about, one of the things you were talking about was the agony you felt knowing that some of your family members who had passed away had gone to hell. And that was something, when my sister committed suicide, I was 19 years old, and the pastor's wife of the church that I was going to at the time, I began questioning and eventually leaving my faith very shortly after that. But she pulled me aside one day and just told me point blank, I'm so sorry that your sister is spending eternity in hell since she committed suicide. And it's like, of all the things that you're already dealing with, for them to just add that on top of that list, it just, it was devastating.
That's, I can't imagine. And, you know, but, I mean, truth be told, though, I think that's probably the one reason why my dad did not kill himself. I think somewhere in the back of his mind, he kind of was afraid of going to hell if he did that. Mm-hmm. He was very suicidal. But I think that's probably the reason why he didn't kill himself. But what a horrible thing. You know, you're grieving as it is, and to tell you, well, sorry, you're never going to see her again because she's roasting, you know.
Right. Yeah.
How sweet.
That's one of the things, and one of the most common things that I hear amongst my friends who have abandoned their faith, and I'm sure that you relate to this as well, and you did touch on this earlier, is the comfort, the sense of comfort you lose when you find out that you're actually not going to see all these people that you loved who passed away, that you're actually not going to see them again. That takes a long time to recover from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Renee, I want to sincerely thank you for coming on here and sharing your story, and you know, for being so open and so vulnerable. I know that that those things are not easy. But, I think it's important for people to hear these stories and to understand that, when we talk about religion and the effect that it has on the world, that we're not talking about, we're not always talking about these abstract academic concepts like, does a God exist? Is sin a thing? And those sorts of things. Like, these are things that really, really and truly have, sometimes horrible effects on people. And, it's something that's not at all easy to talk about. My exit from religion was very, very untraumatic and very, very uneventful. So it's not something, it's not an experience that I share. But, obviously I have struggles of my own. And, talking about those things isn't easy. And, one of the things that makes me respect a person the most is when they're so open and so vulnerable and so honest. And, they can use a story, folks like you who you use your story to try and help other people so it doesn't happen to other people, or so other people are comforted. And I think that's incredible. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. The only thing that I can add, I'm 48 years old now. So I'm a poster child for the abuse that it can do. Mm-hmm. It is long lasting. There is a way through, but it's a lot of hard work.
Absolutely.
And if anyone out there, that's listening wants to reach out, feel free to come find me, and I can get you resources as far as, support networks and things like that.
Yeah, if there's anybody listening who needs any resources like that, email the gaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com and I will put you in touch. And we're going to have you back later in the show for Be a Better Ally. So we will be right back with more Gaytheist Manifesto.
Here's an excerpt from Mum, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee.
It is the same highly regarded concept of an afterlife that allows misguided religious people to justify the mistreatment of those who disagree with their religious ideologies. They are simply trying to protect you from eternal damnation in the afterlife by condemning you, insulting you, and even disowning you in this life. It is not to say that becoming open about your disbelief is always going to be met with these negative reactions, and, in fact, that is precisely what this work is hoping to prevent. But it is important to understand that if you experience negative reactions from religious kin, it is probably a result from the religion's teachings, and likely not from any personal vendetta or hatred.
Mom, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. This week we are recognizing Johnny Ringo. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons-only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. And welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. Next up, we're going to talk about the harm done to the LGBT community by religion. The harms done are many. Things like people being rejected from their family for no other reason than their religious beliefs. People being forced into conversion therapy, opposition to anti-bullying and hate crimes legislation, opposition to anti-discrimination laws, and all of these things. Leading the charge is all of the people leading the charge on this opposition are using the Bible as their weapon. Most famously, recently there was a story of Leila Alcorn who committed suicide because her parents, long story short, her parents, because of their religion, couldn't accept her as trans, tried to send her to conversion therapy, and she ended up committing suicide because of it. So these harms are real.
Yeah, in 2011, this story did not make mainstream news. It happened in South Africa, a gay conversion camp, where 3 teens that were described as, quote, gay and effeminate were starved, tortured, and eventually killed by camp leaders who were trying to, quote, make men out of them. One of the boys was a 19-year-old named Gerard. He was denied access to the toilet, forced to eat his own excrement, beaten with planks, hose pipes, and sticks, forced to do hard manual labor. He was tied to a chair, naked, with his head covered by a pillowcase, and electrocuted with a stun gun.
Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. He was eventually admitted to a hospital where he died in intensive care with burns and wounds all over his body. One of the other boys was an 18-year-old. He died from a seizure, dehydration, and bleeding from the brain. And the third boy was a 19-year-old who was choked to death with a seatbelt. And all of these teenagers, their parents sent them to this camp because they thought that being gay was sinful, and they were, in their minds, trying to help them. And this is what happened to them.
That is unreal.
It really is. And, for people who say, first of all, that this even happened once. That it even happened once is inexcusable. But the fact is, gay conversion therapy is very popular among Christians. I can attest. My mom tried to get me for over 10 years to go to it. Thankfully, she never gave me the ultimatum. Either you do this or you're gone out of the house when I was a teenager. But it was something that she tried to put upon me because in their minds, this is the path to righteousness and being gay, of course, to these folks is not only a sin, but it's a destructive, quote, lifestyle. So
right, and I think it is important to point out that obviously not all religious people feel this way. I mean, there are plenty of religious people who will argue with you that being gay isn't a sin and that being trans isn't a sin, and we can have those sorts of theological arguments, but I do think there is lots of truth to the point that these things are far easier to believe when you have an outside authority telling you what it is. When you're not making the decision for yourself, and you're relying on an authority to make this decision for you. So I wanted to throw that out there. This isn't us, bringing down literally everyone in the religious community, because obviously these aren't points of view that everyone who is religious agrees with.
Yeah, and thankfully these gay conversion therapies are being banned across the United States. That process is underway.
And California, I know conversion therapy for minors is actually illegal in California.
Yeah. So, and of course, not all Christians abide by this, but it's still, I would still say that religious fueled homophobia is still an epidemic. Religious fueled transphobia is still an epidemic, and these things are still happening.
Yeah, one thing that sticks out to me, especially given recent events with, the Josh Duggar molestation scandal and all that sort of stuff. I remember in Arkansas, where the Duggars live, there was an anti-discrimination law on the books that actually passed at one point that would basically give trans people the right to use the public bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity.
Yes.
So trans women in the women's room and trans men in the men's room. And Michelle Duggar recorded a robocall.
Right.
Basically saying that, little girls and women are now in danger of being raped because trans women can use the bathroom. Of course, she called them men in the women's restroom.
Of course.
Because she is a terrible, terrible person. And the law ended up getting repealed, partially because of her role in pushing that whole thing.
Yeah, and of course the irony in that being that it's trans people who are getting hurt and getting assaulted for things as simple as using the right bathroom.
Yeah, if there is a trans person in a public restroom, there is literally one person in that restroom who has a legitimate fear of being harmed, and it is not anyone but the trans person.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And someone, I don't remember who it was who started it. This was just happening a few months ago. They began posting, it was a trans guy. He posted a picture of himself in a woman's bathroom saying, "Do I look like I belong here?"
Oh my God, those pictures were great.
Yeah, and then a lot of other trans folks started following in suit, and I think it was a bit of a moment of awakening, I hope, for people who don't think that a person has enough sense to choose the right bathroom. And, of course, trans people, they're
Michael
just like
Hughes.
cisgender.
Michael Hughes is the guy's name.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it's so funny because he is a very burly looking bearded man wearing a cowboy hat, pretty big guy.
And I think there was even a woman in the background of the photo kind of looking at him
just
like,
looking
"What are you
so
doing?"
confused. Yeah.
So, trans people, they just want to use the bathroom. They're just like cis people. So of course that was ridiculous, but, thanks, Michelle. And as it turns out, her own family is dealing with this molestation.
Shock. And she knew about it when she made that whole thing. So, yeah.
Yep.
And they continue to speak out about sexual immorality, which is just absolutely brilliant to me.
Well, it's kind of like Bristol Palin talking about abstinence while having...
Right. Not just talking about abstinence, but making hundreds of thousands of dollars being an abstinence advocate.
Yeah, and this is the thing, this is not a judgment against someone having kids out of wedlock. Obviously, that's not something that we're going to ever condemn, because that's not our place to judge.
There is nothing wrong with being a single parent. There is everything wrong with being a raging hypocrite.
Exactly.
And making tons of money from it.
Yeah, so, and it just goes to show you, and we see this so much among the conservative Christian right, where it's just rife with hypocrisy. Right-wing senators proposing and passing bills that are anti-LGBT while they're out there having gay sex with prostitutes or things like that. It's just, if someone protests a little too much about something, that usually there's I won't say usually, but it seems like a lot of times, right, especially in matters of morality.
Methinks he doth protest too much.
Bingo. So
another obvious thing that LGBT folks deal with is family rejection. That's religious based.
Yes.
And I mean, that's something that I've experienced, not near to the extent that some people do. I have a strained and nearly broken relationship with my grandma and a completely and totally broken relationship with my aunt, who, my aunt I used to be super close to. She helped my mom raise me because my mom was a single parent. She helped my mom raise me until my mom got married when I was like 9 or 10. So we used to be super, super close, and now we just plain don't have a relationship because I came out as trans and she refuses to accept it, acknowledge it, or even talk about it.
Yeah, and I want people to understand that because I think a lot of folks who are listening to this show who are straight have probably heard stories of gay, bi, and trans kids who are kicked out of their house because of their sexuality or their gender identity, and that does happen. But that's one end. That's one end of the extreme when it comes to family rejection. There are so many shades in between. From being treated as an outcast in the family to not being invited to family events, feeling rejected, just things like that cause varying degrees of stress. I mean, that's something that I experience with my parents. Thankfully, my brother and my sister-in-law accept me, but it's stressful. I was never kicked out of the house for being gay when I was a teenager, but it was something that I still had to deal with, that constant rejection and disapproval.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who is a trans woman, and her presentation is is sort of butch because that's what she likes and that's who she is, and her mom constantly is telling her like, you'd probably get more dates if you looked more like a woman.
Ugh.
And I just when she tells me about stuff like that, I just I die a little on the inside. Like, that is, it's so awful. So there are some cases where outright rejection may even be the better thing than, that constant sort of, passive aggressive and maybe not so passive aggressive, sort of attitude that people encounter. Perfect example. I had a confrontation with my grandma yesterday. I'm living with my grandma temporarily because, long story, but I was cleaning out my car and I found a pre-transition picture of myself that I did not want to exist anymore. And I don't have a blanket problem with pre-transition pictures of me. There's a ton of them on Facebook. But that particular picture wasn't associated with such a great memory.
Right.
And I didn't want it to exist because I didn't want to see myself that way, and I don't really want to be reminded of that time in my life. So I tossed it in the trash. No big deal. Didn't want the picture to exist anymore, didn't want to have it anymore. So my grandma dug the picture out of the trash and said, "You shouldn't throw away pictures of yourself." And I said, "Well, that's my picture of me to do with what I want, and you need to give me that picture because I'm going to get rid of it." And she absolutely refused to do so, took it and hid it from me. So, just complete and utter lack of respect for me and my wishes when it comes to images of myself. And that was just, I was kind of violently angry after that. Just complete and total lack of respect for my wishes when it comes to things that very much involve me.
That's awful. And it's something that I think, that's an experience that you have as a trans person that, that's meaningful to you. And I think a lot of folks who are gay or trans can relate to situations like that, where even if the family member isn't being outright abusive in the sense that people think of, physical abuse or threatening to kick them out of the house, these are still things that take a major toll on your psyche and your ability to be happy, and they're significant. I just saw this news. It popped up yesterday. Senator Franken proposed this bill to help reduce bullying against LGBTQ youth in public schools. He voted for a bill to end discrimination based on actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity in public schools.
See, and that's so important. The actual or perceived.
Yes.
That's so important. That's something that we talk about in GLSEN a lot, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, surrounding safe schools for LGBT kids. Like, you don't necessarily have to be gay or trans to experience anti-gay or trans bullying. If you fit, one of the silly stereotypes about gay or trans people, or if you step outside of, traditional gender roles, you're, a guy who's a little too sensitive or a girl who's a little too masculine, like, those kinds of things. Like, you don't necessarily have to be queer to experience that kind of discrimination. So I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, it's mega important. I mean, I can say from my own experience, when I was in middle school, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, I didn't even know I was gay then, and I was still bullied. People in my class were calling me all kinds of gay slurs, just because, like you said, I was a sensitive kid. I read a lot. I didn't play sports. I only had one friend who was another guy, and who also turned out to be gay. By the way, I found out some years ago. But yeah, I didn't even know that I was gay at the time, and I was still bullied for that. But of course, in this case, 45 Republicans, and they were only Republicans, 45 of them, they all voted against this bill because they apparently don't care about bullying of queer kids. And there's a list. Well, Callie will post the link in the show notes of these senators who actually did vote against this. And the Republicans from states all over the country, a lot of southern and midwestern states, as you can imagine. And there's also a list of the senators who voted to help protect it. And they're mostly Democrats. There are a few Republicans in there. But, obviously, it's important to know what your representatives are voting for and against. So I encourage you guys to check that out.
Well, right. And I think, we play spots on the show every once in a while for Secular Coalition of America. And, just want to give them a shout out. They send out these action alerts when bills like this are being voted on, and it gives you the opportunity to make your voice heard and say to your, representative or your senator and say, hey, this is a thing that's important to me, and this is why I think you should vote this way as, one of your constituents. And, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah from No Religion Required, he posted something on Facebook. He actually got a personalized response from somebody from doing these action alerts. So, Secular Coalition, I think it's secularcoalition.org. I'll play the spot right after the segment, so we'll know. But I think that's important. I think it's interesting when you hear, when you see people like that put their money where their mouth is, because you can hear people say all the time, like, well, I don't hate or wish anything bad on gay people. I just think it's a sin, blah, blah, blah. So if you said, okay, well, do you think people deserve to be bullied for their actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity? Don't you think these people should at least feel safe in the environments that they're in? And I bet you they would all tell you to your face, like, well, yeah, of course, nobody deserves to be treated badly like that. But when it comes to, like, actually taking action to make sure that these folks are protected, they sit on their hands and vote against it. So I think that tells you where their head is really at. They're either kowtowing to their constituents who don't care or actively support that kind of bullying, or they actually feel that way themselves. So I think that's I think that betrays a lot of their real feelings on the subject.
I agree, and like it or not, these Republican senators and these Republican leaders in our government, a major part of their constituency is very based in Christianity, and it's very important to their constituency for laws that have religious basis to be passed. So a big part of how these Republicans vote is based on what do my constituents want, and they typically don't care for LGBTQ people, and in a lot of cases, whether it's the constituents themselves or these senators, they don't have the experience of really knowing LGBTQ people personally, and when you don't have that personal experience with someone, it's easier to not see them as a real human being and to see it more as just this group of people who are icky and you don't like.
I was just going to say this group of sexually immoral idolaters who...
Deviants.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I think it's really hard to be a gay or a trans person and to not care about politics, because our country is so divided right now, kind of almost right down the middle. On one side, you have religious conservatives who want laws passed that support their religion and that sort of force Christianity on the rest of the world. And on the other side, you have the people who are against that and or at least don't want religious harm to play a role in our society and our government. And so I think it's impossible now for you to be gay or trans and to not care about what's happening in the political landscape. Because I hear a lot of my friends say, especially my straight friends, and not really a lot of them, but a good number of them, that they don't care about politics and they don't want to get in political conversations. But they have to understand, because religious harm is such a central part of the Republican platform right now. We can't afford not to care about them. We have to care about them because they're voting against us, and they're voting for measures, and they're voting for measures that hurt us, and they're voting against measures that protect us. So we don't really have a choice. We have to care about politics.
Well, right, and that's kick back to the last episode about privilege. Mm-hmm. I definitely think it's a manifestation of privilege to be able to say, yeah, I don't care about politics, because your everyday life isn't affected, generally speaking, by the things that these people are deciding on.
Right.
So yeah, and then there's the other side of, people who don't care about politics because they're not even there yet, and everyday life is a struggle, and they're just trying to figure out how to survive. Mm-hmm. So they're not necessarily worried about anti-discrimination laws. They're just trying to figure out how to not die before the end of the day. So I think that's an important thing to remember too.
Indeed.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with Be a Better Ally on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
The staff of Secular Coalition for America lobbies U.S. Congress on issues of separation of church and state, and they've become a powerhouse for change in the United States government. You'll definitely want to subscribe to receive their email action alerts. These are updates for important issues and ones that you can get involved with directly. And hopefully, you'll consider making a contribution to the Secular Coalition for America to help them continue fighting for your equality. You can do it all at secular.org.
So friends, one more quick thing before we jump back into Be a Better Ally here. My good friend Jake Farwharton made me aware of a fundraiser going on for someone who's a member of the Australian secular community. And not that we need special reasons to want to support people and do good things, but the Australian skeptic community has been very good to me, believe it or not, as this upstart, American atheist activist, podcaster, folks like Adam Reeks and Jake Farwharton and Nick Morganmore and Annie from the group Women Without Religion, and lots of those people have been really, really good to me, and I know we have listeners in Australia. So Jake told me this story about the Matthews family and Jody, who has stage 4B cervical cancer. And I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what that means, but it's the prognosis is apparently not great, but there is hope. Her husband was cured by science and continues to live after non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there are experimental treatments that Jody is trying to access that are very, very expensive, and they're raising money. And I think it's a worthy cause, given to me by people who I trust. And I can safely say that if you decide to donate, that I can say that I trust 100% that this money is actually going for a good cause and it's going to go to do good things. So if you're so inclined, the website is www.jodymatthewsappeal.com. That's JODEMATTHEWSAPPEAL.com. And if you're so inclined, make a donation. If not everybody's in a position to do that, and that's okay. But maybe give it a share on your Facebook, on your Twitter, whatever social media you have. I've been pretty amazed by the generosity of the secular community, and when calls are put out like this. So, let's do something good here. Let's help somebody out, and check the website out and see what you can do. Thanks. Welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. For this week's Be a Better Ally segment, we have Renee again. So, Renee, talk to me a little bit about how people can, because as we talked about in the first segment, stories like yours are not incredibly unique. These things happen far more often than I think most people realize. So, given that fact, how can people in the community be better to support people who have been through the things that you've been through, and not only to support, but maybe even to prevent those things from happening? So can you talk a little bit about that?
You were just basically saying, people saying it's not as bad as it seems, and I think that's where we lost you.
Yeah, there are some people, when you try to, if they ask you questions and you try to explain to them, things that are going on, a lot of times people will dismiss what you're saying or say, oh, it couldn't have been as bad as what you think it was. And I think what a lot of people need to realize is when people like me come forward and, tell their stories, there are a lot of details that are actually left out, and a lot of times it's worse than what you're hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
But the most helpful thing that people can do if they really care about a person is just to listen. Sometimes there is no advice that you can give someone, but just listening helps. Even if you can't solve their problem or do anything for them, they just need to be heard. A thing that I like to do as being a good humanist is, knowing what resources are available out there for people who are in, similar situation. That way I can direct them to people who can help them. And there are several resources out there as far as helping people who are trying to leave a religion, or people who need therapy, people who need a safe place from domestic abuse. I just try to, I guess because it's pertinent to me since I've been there, I try to keep up with what's available out there so I can send other people to get help that was not there when I needed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to ask you to plug those resources at the end of the segment so people can know where to go. Yeah, one of the things that I used to help run a nonprofit that was a peer support community for folks affected by rape and sex abuse. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that I have a history of. So when I was getting into that, one of the first things that I said is like, well, how am I going to have a coherent conversation with somebody about this? Because it's nothing that I've experienced before. And that was, I hesitated getting involved because of that, because I didn't want to think like, I can't speak on your behalf. I don't know what you've been through.
Right.
And we had a therapist friend of ours, and we had dinner, and I was talking about that because I was like, we do this, somebody's going to come to me and they're going to tell me their story. And the last thing that I want to do is say something hurtful or unhelpful, because you can still do that even with the best of intentions.
Oh, yeah.
And what she told me was so helpful. And I think this actually applies in a lot of different situations. But she said, when people come forward and tell you their story like that, like, primarily they want to know that you believe them, because so many people don't believe you when you come forward with a thing like that. You want to validate their feelings. How you feel about this is okay. Whether you're angry, you're sad, you're pissed off, you're hurt, you're depressed. All of those feelings are okay to feel. Mm-hmm. And then 3, that you care, that it matters to you. And those 3 things are really what people are looking for. Like, most of the time when people come forward, they're not looking for you to solve their problems or give you any sort of profound advice. People just want to know that other people care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the worst thing that you can tell somebody is, I know exactly how you feel. And,
right.
You just, no, you don't, because you're not that person.
Right,
so
exactly.
You can't.
Yeah, I think there's a fine line between saying like, well, I can empathize because there's some sort of parallel experience maybe, but to claim like, oh my gosh, I know exactly where you're coming from. No, you don't. And that's okay. You don't have to be able to empathize and to be able to care. You don't have to understand something completely.
You don't. If you say something like, I'm so sorry that happened, here's a hug. I think most people will understand that you have good intentions when you say that, and they'll take it for what you're offering, as something positive that you want to help.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't have any words to say, and that's okay.
Right.
Hugs are always welcome.
Right.
At least for me.
Yep. Hugs are medicine for me.
Yeah, they're medicine.
For me as well.
If you don't know someone really well, you might want to ask them first, like a hug. But hugs are always great. But just, saying I'm here and I care, that's what people are looking for.
Well, and one thing that you often hear is, somebody will say something, and I've heard this from people who are very well-intentioned and people who aren't very well-intentioned. And you hear people say things that sort of imply that, the worse things get, responsibility starts to shift towards the person on the receiving end of the abuse because they stay.
Yeah.
The 3 of us know that that's bullshit. But can you talk a little bit about that and why, one, why that's a horrible thing to say, and why, two, it's frankly just incorrect, like just factually wrong?
Oh, goodness. That was a huge, part of the mental games that was going on with me. It was victim blaming. I was doing something wrong. I wasn't trying hard enough. I was doing something to push his buttons or should be more sensitive. And whenever he would get arrested, I'm the one who would get in trouble. If you can imagine that.
Yeah.
My first sergeant would call me down in the office and say, you need to control him. And I'm thinking, how do I do that? I weigh 88 pounds and he weighs 160 and you want me to control him?
Right.
How do I make that happen? And, it's like, oh, look what you've done to him. You're making him act all violent and crazy because you left him. It was...
Isn't that insane?
It was always the woman's fault, always, no matter what. Yeah. And even if he would show up somewhere and I would walk away and not engage and not say a word, it finally got to where I'm the one who was told you can't come here anymore because he's going to show up and start some drama. It was always my fault.
It's always up to you to not make him act out.
Yeah, up to me to control him and up to me to fix it. And, I must be doing something wrong or else this wouldn't be occurring.
So did you often hear people telling you, why don't you just leave? And, why do you stay? How did you navigate that?
Well, I didn't have anyone telling me that when I was in the military because they knew that I couldn't. Going AWOL is a thing, and for the people who are not military, that's absent without leave.
Yes.
That's probably the one thing that kept me alive, because if I had shown up missing, people at work would have known. And they would have come looking for me. But, after getting out, I have had people tell me that, why did you not just leave? And it's like, well, physically he would not let me.
Right.
So how could I make that happen? But for a lot of people who are not in my situation, fear will make them stay. Mm-hmm. Or if they have no money or resources, sometimes they have no place to go. I know that in Indiana right now, there's a shortage on shelter spaces. There's about a 6-week wait. So if a woman did want to leave, where is she going to go?
Right.
Yeah.
And especially if she has children, what does she do?
And especially if she's a queer woman, she's a trans woman, like it just gets worse from there.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, you mentioned earlier that you like to keep up with resources that people can reach out to get help. So talk a little bit about the resources that you tend to keep up with, the organizations and people that you believe in that are doing good work in these areas.
No longer quivering. Vicki Garrison has a blog on Pathos, and she has a lot of links to a lot of resources. There's also the Recovering from Religion people that I would recommend people go there as far as trying to figure out how to get out of religion if they're struggling. They do have a new hotline that they have up and running since February. Another resource for them is Secular Avenue. Alex Jules is behind that one, and that is a place for people who are victims of domestic abuse, so that way they can have a safe place to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Noelle George is part of that too. She was actually the first guest ever on our podcast.
Those are 3 really good starting points. Mm-hmm. And if people need other resources, they can get a hold of me, and if I don't have a person for them to go to, I can find one.
How can people contact you if they want to do so?
They can find me on Facebook. My name is Renee Davis Pelt. Or they can email me at bridget.fitch2112@gmail.com. And I'm also on the Holy Crap vlogcast. So they can find me that way.
Which is a fun show. I've been on a couple of times.
Thanks,
it's a very fun show. Well, thank you again for sharing your story and for sharing your perspective. We really, really appreciate you taking the time. So, yeah, just thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Renee. It was really enlightening.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to say thank you to my co-host, Daniel.
My pleasure.
And, of course, thanks to Renee again for being on the show. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali.
And I'm on Twitter at Daniel Wolfsong.
And you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, and knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, my friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.